You guys ever sit down to write a chord progression and it just ends up sounding really stale and sort of uninteresting? Well, I've been working really hard on my piano skills lately, and in the process of learning a bunch of new songs, I discovered a really easy and simple way for you to spice up your chord progressions, and it all has to do with the root note. So stick with me, I'm gonna show you how I use that process to spice up chord progressions and how you can use it as well. So just to illustrate this process, I'm gonna start off with the most basic and boring progression that I can think of, the 1-4-5. Not always boring, but in this case it will be. Okay, so obviously we need to find a way to make that more inspiring and interesting. One thing that you'll see people recommend to get sort of a basic bass melody going is to just use the root note, or in this case, the first note of the triad as the root note to create your chord progression. But as you can hear, it gets really stale that way. And so what I'm advocating for is a different approach where you start to use basically anything but the root note of the chord. So you can start really simply with this progression, for example, where instead of using C, right, which is the first note of the first chord, let's use the bass note as the second or the third note in the chord progression. So if we did it with this progression and we just shifted these up a little bit, it starts to sound a little bit different. And if we used the third note instead, it's different again. Now this gets really, really interesting when you start using more complex chords too, because you have more options. You don't just have the first, third, and fifth notes. You have, seventh notes, ninths, 11ths, and it gets really, really cool. But what I want to do next is show you what it sounds like going through the scale a little bit and picking out different notes that are not in the chord. And that's really where it gets to be way more interesting, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to C here for our first one. And I just want to loop this first chord over and over again. And I'm going to start shifting the bass notes so you can hear what each note in the scale sounds like with this particular chord, right? Right? So even right there, I really like this chord. So let's do the same thing with the next chord here and shift the bass notes to a different note in the scale that's not in the chord, okay? So that means that with this next chord, we're not gonna be able to use F, A, or C, okay? So then you might go through and just say, I wanna stick with the first one that we did, right? So D. Then we'll do this with the final chord as well. So again, anything but G, B, or D. So let's say that we liked this version where we're using E as the bass note. And then let's join this together with the other chords that we've got, and I'll pull this up so you can see what we're listening to. And we'll just listen through to the chord progression that we've got with the new bass notes. Once you've got to this stage, one thing that I like to play around with is the inversions of the chords. So when we've changed the root notes, sometimes it's nice to change the order that the notes are being played in. So if I take these top two notes and bring everything down so everything is kind of closer together, let's see what this sounds like now. One other thing that I found this to be really useful for too is when you're creating a B part for your song. So you can take like the same triads that you have been using, but you just change the bass melody or the bass notes in relation to the other notes, and it automatically changes the chord. So now we're actually getting a lot of seventh chords just from changing the bass note alone outside of the triads that we're using in the initial chord progression, which is really cool. And this is something that anybody can do. You don't need to like be able to play the keys or whatever. You can just drag notes around in piano roll if you want to, and just play around with the relationships that develop over time. And like I said, really pull on that thread of creativity until you come up with something that catches your ear, and then keep producing out from that point forward. I want to give you guys a good real world example of how I actually use this in one of my beats. So the beat sounds like this. Okay, so that's what it sounds like. The actual chord progression is like this, so you can hear it a little bit better. This is, I'm just gonna play it on the Rhodes here. So now take a listen to what it would sound like if I just used the bass as the root notes of the actual triads themselves. It's really lost a lot of its luster, right? And again, if I select all these bass notes, we go up an octave, you can see that none of them are actually in the chord itself in the triad. So it ends up sounding a lot cooler and a lot more interesting, a lot more flavorful once you actually change up all of those and start converting what you're doing into, you know, sevenths and ninths and elevenths, and all just from changing the bass notes all within the scale itself. And I promise you, your ear will start to pick up on things that you want to explore further and with whatever you're working on. So definitely try this out. And if you have any questions about this process, let me know. It can get as complex or, you know, as simple as you want it to be, but it's been a really valuable tool for my own creativity. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, and I will talk to you very, very soon. And as always, happy music making. We'll see you in the next video. Peace.